Hi, I'm Nick Seiter. I'm a field crop entomologist with the University of Illinois. In this session, I'll be discussing the Dectes stem borer, which is an insect pest of soybean that we've been dealing with maybe a little more frequently in recent years in Illinois than we're used to. So this insect has been present in Illinois for quite some time. It's native to the United States, and presumably it's native to Illinois. However, in recent years, we've been noticing this as a pest of soybean a little more frequently. And this sort of came to a head in 2018. You recall the fall of 2018 was a difficult one for soybean harvest. We had very wet conditions. We had a difficult time getting into the field in many cases. And because a lot of our fields had to stay out longer than we would have liked to as mature beans, we suffered some lodging from this pest over not a huge area in southern Illinois, but a larger area perhaps than we're used to seeing problems with Dectes stem borer. So if you're not familiar with the adult, it's this sort of bluish gray Longhorn Beetle. This would be about a half an inch to 3/4 of an inch long. Fairly distinctive insect. You're not likely to confuse this as an adult with a whole lot of other beetles that we find in soybean. Now, the adult, in and of itself, is not going to do any real damage. It'll feed on the foliage a little bit, but we're not going to experience damage from the adult. It's actually the larval stage of this insect that's going to cause the pest problems. But with Dectes stem borer, we have one generation per year, and the hosts include giant ragweed and sunflower in addition to soybean. Now, Dectes is going to overwinter as a mature larva, a large larva, in residue. And in soybean, this looks kind of like this. They create this little cell for themselves down at the base of the soybean stem. They seal it off, as you can see there. Part of the reason for sealing it off is very likely to prevent cannibalism. So to prevent other Dectes larvae that may be in that plant from working their way down in and actually consuming the larva that created this cell, in addition to protecting them from the elements, protecting them from desiccating, all the reasons that an insect would normally create an overwintering cell like this. Now, when the spring comes and the larvae become active again, they will pupate and they'll begin emerging as adults beginning towards the end of June. At this point, that adult Dectes stem borer will lay her eggs, the female, in soybean petioles, and the larva will begin feeding on the pith within that petiole. Very often, usually in fact, this is going to be the first potential indication that you have a Dectes stem borer infestation in a soybean field, as you'll start to see these dying petioles as you see here. So that's a pretty good early indication that you may have Dectes stem borer feeding. And as that larva works its way up and down the petiole, of course, as you see here, it's killing that petiole, and then eventually it's going to work its way into the main stem. And to see this, you would actually have to, of course, split open that stem, split it open, and look for that sort of fat, creamy white larva within the stem. Of course, they'll line the tunnels of this, or they'll line these tunnels with frass, their excrement, as they move through there. Pretty obvious when you see this. You're definitely not going to confuse this sort of damage with anything else that occurs in soybean, or you're not likely to, except perhaps the lesser cornstalk borer. There are a few other insect pests that will burrow into soybean stem. This is going to happen later in the season than when we see an infestation of that insect. But once you've learned to identify Dectes stem borer, you're not likely to confuse it with anything else. Now, the biggest surprise in all of this, I would say, is that this burrowing through the main stem by Dectes stem borer really isn't a source of yield reduction. And that, when you look at this, is surprising. I know I had a hard time believing that the first time I saw it. Our colleagues elsewhere in the US were actually able to confirm this by experimentally excluding Dectes stem borer from plots of soybean that they had treated with a systemic insecticide that we don't have available in soybean, a material called fipronil that results in pretty effective control of this insect. And comparing heavily infested plots with plots that had no Dectes stem borer infestation, they saw very little or no difference in yield. So we're not losing a meaningful amount of yield from this damage, which again is surprising based on how it looks. Of course, a lot of this main stem tunneling, and especially a lot of the really ugly tunneling of the main stem, is occurring late in the season, probably after most of our seed fill has occurred. It's also not clear how much reduction of vascular flow we're actually getting from this damage. But the results of this main stem tunneling in terms of yield are fairly inconsequential. If there is some yield reduction there, it's so slight that we have a hard time measuring it, have a hard time picking it up. That's not to say there isn't a concern with Dectes stem borer infestation in these fields. One thing I should note, occasionally there are some parasitoids that will feed on Dectes stem borer, and that's what you see here. I don't know if you can see very well this goo that's sitting down here is what's left of one of these Dectes stem borer larvae. All of these are little parasitic flies that actually feed on those Dectes stem borer larvae within the stem. But again, the big surprise here is that when we see that main stem tunneling, we don't see yield reduction from that per se. However, we do have a chance to potentially lose some yield from Dectes stem borer. And the reason for that yield reduction is the potential for lodging later on in the season. So as I mentioned earlier, Dectes stem borer is going to overwinter as a mature larva down in the base of the stem. Actually, very often you can see that this is about to occur because they'll work their way down to the base of the stem and they'll actually girdle the base of that stem. And very often this will result in the little pile of sawdust that you see down here near the base of that stem. Now they've girdled that, and that stem is going to actually fall over at the slightest pressure at that point. That's again by design. That helps to protect them from the elements. It helps to protect them from competing insects, including other Dectes stem borer larvae. But the result of that is plants that fall over very easily, and all the difficulties in harvest, the potential yield reduction, slowing down of harvest that can result from this. This is a picture from Eric Allinger down in southern Illinois, and you can see each one of these plants has been pruned or clipped by a stem borer larvae, and they've all fallen over. And you can see, actually, if you look inside of there, there's that little plug down in the base of the stem, if you can see that there. So they made themselves a nice little overwintering cavity in the base of this stem, as you can see here again. And you can even see, if you look closely there, the little C-shaped girdle that they've created, where they've cut that very cleanly. They've packed that cavity with a combination of sawdust and frass, created a nice little cozy home for themselves for the winter. And of course, the consequences of that for us, if we're harvesting soybean, is not good. You can get lodging. You can occasionally get lodging over an extensive area, but typically it's going to be patches within the field, right, where the plants have gone down from these stem borers. Again, as I mentioned earlier, like in 2018, typically this is going to happen when not only you have a high degree of this girdling out there in the field, so you have a high degree of Dectes stem borer infestation, but you also have plants that have been allowed to stay out in the field after they've been mature for quite some time. So this really tends to occur when we have a delayed harvest. So that combination of Dectes stem borer infestation and harvest delays can be a bad one in terms of lodging. So that's the situation that we are trying to avoid. That's what we want to stay away from in these fields where we have a potential Dectes stem borer problem. Now, where we're going to see this issue, again, I've mentioned southern Illinois several times throughout the talk. Where we really see higher populations of Dectes stem borer is where we have higher levels of conservation tillage and no-till in a region. Not necessarily within one field, but in that region as a whole, that allows those populations to build up. As you might imagine, since that larva is overwintering in the base of the stem, tillage does help to reduce their survival over the summer. Now, tillage as a control in a field that has an established Dectes stem borer population really isn't going to be all that effective. Okay, this is not a situation where you build a population up and you till it and you get rid of it. You're not going to get that dramatic of mortality from tillage in an individual field. It's this year after year of no-till in a region that really seems to allow these populations to build up. And so that's why we see this more often than not in southern Illinois, where we have a high degree of no-till. And, you know, just to be clear, I'm not suggesting we go away from no-till for this insect. Relatively minor pest problem, right? This isn't something that's going to limit our production systems. This isn't something that's going to have a dramatically negative effect on soybean production. This is an insect we can live with. This is a pest that we can manage based on the amount of yield reduction that it causes, which is generally fairly slight. But it is something we're more likely to see in areas where we have a high degree of no-till. Now, one of the reasons I mentioned that, in Illinois we've been dealing with this primarily in the southern third of Illinois. However, it's not necessarily limited to the southern third of Illinois in terms of where it can overwinter. They've noted this insect as an occasional pest in the southern half of Nebraska, for instance. So it can very likely overwinter successfully throughout Illinois. And it's certainly something that, while we haven't seen issues with it yet, something we should look out for in other parts of the state where we have a high degree of conservation tillage and no-till. In northwestern Illinois, for instance, there's certainly the potential for the distribution of this insect to continue to sort of expand. Now, in terms of management options, what do we have? Well, of course, the bad news on this, like with many protected feeders that are feeding on the inside of the plant, control with insecticides is difficult. And in this case, while we can get some mortality with certain spray regimes, my colleagues and I have not been able to find really an insecticide control program that's going to be effective, that's going to be economically beneficial. Keep in mind, since we're not seeing yield loss from the stem tunneling itself, it becomes fairly difficult to predict which situations we're going to see an actual problem with Dectes in terms of lodging versus which situations we're going to have the stem borer in our fields and not really experience any negative effects from it. very difficult to make that prediction early in the season because in large part, again, it's going to depend on those weather conditions later in the season and how early we're able to get those beans out of there. But we don't have an insecticide regime that's going to be economically beneficial. Part of the reason for that, most of the insecticide controls that have been tested against this insect, of course, they've been targeting the adults, the ovipositing adults, because once that insect gets inside of the stem, it's protected from those insecticides. Well, those adults are laying their eggs over about a 6-week period of time, 6 to 8 weeks, actually. A single application is not going to cover that period of time. It would take multiple applications throughout that period to get meaningful control of the larvae, and that's simply not going to pay for itself in terms of an economic benefit. Again, especially when you consider that we really can't make a good prediction on when we're going to suffer yield loss at the time that infestation is going on, because it depends on other factors. Well, that's kind of a long and roundabout way of saying that what we really want to key in on here, what we want to focus on in terms of management of Dectes stem borer, is the management of lodging. That's what we want to avoid. We want to take steps to avoid having our field fall down on us, right? Because again, that's where we're seeing potential yield loss. We're not losing yield just from that burrowing within the main stem. So we do have a few cultural control options available to us. Of course, the best one, maybe not surprisingly, the best thing we can do is have a nice, timely harvest of these fields that are infested with Dectes stem borer. Now, we would harvest every soybean field in the state in a timely manner every single year if we could, right? No one wants to let their beans sit out there even a minute longer than they have to, right? So that's a little bit of it's not always a helpful recommendation to get those beans out of the field on time. I realize that everybody wants to get all their beans out of the field on time. What we can do is, through scouting earlier in the season, identify those fields where we have a Dectes stem borer infestation, and hopefully, where we can, prioritize those to get those out of the field first. Put those at the top of the docket where we can. Again, not always possible. The weather dictates a lot of this, but we can do the best we can to try to get those fields that are infested out of there. And there's two things you really want to look at to identify those. First, look for these dead and dying petioles, like we mentioned earlier. These can occur throughout the canopy. Actually, it depends a little bit on the height of that canopy when those adults are moving into the system. Sometimes you'll find those way up at the top of the canopy. Other times you have to sort of dig through the canopy to find these. But these dead and dying petioles, and they actually will fall off of there. So you'll see occasionally these broken off at the base of the stem. That's the first indication that you have. And if you're seeing a lot of this, go ahead and pull some stems and split them open and see if you can find those Dectes stem borer larvae within the stem. Again, when we're talking about getting into the reproductive stages later on in the season, there's not a lot that you're going to confuse a Dectes stem borer larva with here in Illinois. Pretty easy to identify once you've learned to identify that insect. The other thing to look for is going to be closer to harvest, and that's these piles of sawdust at the base of infested plants. And particularly where you're going to find these little piles of sawdust is at the base of plants where that larva has already girdled the inside of that stem. So as you might imagine, if you start seeing a lot of this sort of damage, that's really a pretty good indication that you need to get that field harvested as soon as you possibly can to avoid some of the lodging that can occur from this insect. So that's kind of your early warning, and this is your late warning here. These little piles of sawdust indicating that you have girdling going on out in the field and indicating that you could have lodging very soon. So again, a timely harvest is the best thing that we can do to the extent that we have control over how soon we're able to harvest. Removal of alternate hosts, while not really proven experimentally, is a reasonable approach to take in terms of reducing these populations, again, in an area. And the alternative host I'm concerned with in particular here is going to be giant ragweed. I don't think we have large amounts of sunflower in southern Illinois to where we would be worried about that. Although if you're in an area with large amounts of sunflower, by all means keep an eye on that, and that could be an opportunity to build those populations up. Interestingly, there's also some work being done currently by some of my colleagues to study if you can use sunflower actually as a trap crop to draw those insects in and hold them there. So actually take advantage of that host preference this insect has for sunflower from a management perspective. Don't have any results on that yet, so can't really confirm whether or not that's effective. But getting rid of ragweed, giant ragweed in an area, if you can, could be one way to help reduce the population of this insect. And the great thing about reducing giant ragweed is even if you don't reduce the population of that insect, you're going to make summer just a little more pleasant for folks like me who get sick as a dog when they're around giant ragweed. So really a win-win, right? No one wants that junk on the side of their field anyway. But again, not a proven management tool, but one that could perhaps offer some benefits in terms of Dectes stem borer population control. Destruction of residue, as I mentioned earlier, you will get increased mortality of Dectes larvae in a situation where you have tillage or another method to destroy that residue. What you're not going to get from this is what I would call effective control. You're not going to see 80, 90, 95% reduction of that population from a tillage operation. You're going to see what I would consider suppression. Maybe 40%, 50%, 60% reduction of survival in there. Bear in mind that survival of the overwintering adults, in many cases, when you have a situation like that where you've killed the overwintering adults, they can make up for that if more of their eggs survive. So if you have fewer gravid females out there, but more of their eggs survive because it wasn't as crowded, because you didn't have as dense of an egg lay, you may or may not get effective reduction of the larvae from that approach. But it is important to realize that you're more likely to see these insects in areas where you do have a high degree of no-till, like we see in most of southern Illinois, and for good reason, because of the erosion issues that we have in that part of the state. And again, just to be clear, I'm not making a comparison of this insect as an issue with soil erosion as an issue. Soil erosion is a much bigger issue in southern Illinois than Dectes stem borer is. This is probably something that we're going to have to live with to some extent in those areas where we have reduced tillage. And that's okay. Again, when we don't see lodging from this insect, we're not seeing yield loss. And that's really one of the key takeaways of this talk. Don't worry about that tunneling so much, even as ugly as it looks. Worry about the cases where we actually have lodging. That's where this insect is actually costing you money. If you're not seeing that lodging, you're not losing anything from it. If you get that field out of there in time before the plants start falling over, you're good in terms of Dectes stem borer management. So that's really, again, when we talk about Dectes stem borer, it's relatively, it's not new to Illinois, but it's sort of new to our consciousness, it's a pest that we're newly aware of in southern Illinois, but one that shouldn't scare anybody, and one that we can effectively manage by preventing that lodging. Certainly, we're looking at some alternative management. We'll explore chemical management of this insect in the future. We'll explore some additional cultural practices to see what we can do early in the season to help prevent the potential for lodging from it. But the big thing to keep in mind here if you're not seeing that lodging at the end of the season, you're not losing yield in a meaningful way from this insect pest. With that, just a few resources that we have available to us. We'll have a new edition of these applied research results available later on in the season. Hopefully we'll have this available by the time this recording is released. If not, the new results will be put up here at Crop Central. That's a new resource we're putting together that's going to include our management recommendations, not just insect management, but crop management, production related in general. So be sure to check that out. Finally, we did publish a fact sheet on Dectes stem borer. I believe that was a little over a year ago. We're coming up on a year right now, so certainly check that out. Of course, it's got a lot of the same information that we've discussed in this talk. But with that, thank you for your time. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions. You're always more than welcome to shoot me an email, give me a call, send me a text, get a hold of me through Twitter if you wish. Wish you a happy production system this year. And again, thank you for watching and thank you for participating in this session.